Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to a special Watchman Newscast breaking news update. Now, we usually come to you every Tuesday and Thursday, but this one could not wait. Major news overnight out of the Middle East, Israel striking Iranian and Syrian targets inside Syria. Now, we'd usually come to you from our Watchman studio, but today I'm coming to you from the comfort of my living room because this could not wait. This is breaking news. Okay, let's rewind. Yesterday, Tuesday, November 17th, the Israel Defense Forces found 3 improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, basically mines, planted along the Syria-Israel border. Now, the mines in particular were in a buffer zone on Israel's Golan Heights. It's a buffer zone that separates Israeli territory from Syrian territory. Well, according to Israeli officials, Iranian-backed Syrian operatives, sometime over the past several days or weeks, infiltrated that buffer zone and planted these bombs. They were targeted, obviously, at Israeli soldiers, folks, because Israeli soldiers, the IDF, they are frequently inside that buffer zone, walking around and doing surveillance and monitoring the whole area. So these bombs were meant specifically for IDF soldiers with deadly intent, again, directed by Iran's Quds Force. More on them in a minute. How do we know this was Iran? Well, if you remember on previous newscasts, back in August, the Iranian regime tried a similar tactic. 4 Syrian fighters, radical Syrian fighters aligned with the Iranian regime under their orders, tried to infiltrate that buffer area and plant bombs on Israel's Golan Heights that would target, maim, murder Israeli soldiers. Those 4 Syrian fighters were killed. They were taken out by the Israel Defense Forces. You would think message sent, right? But apparently the Iranian regime did not get the memo. So Israel uncovered these IEDs yesterday, 3 of them at least, along the Syrian-Israeli border. And Israel reacted overnight. This is breaking news again, with pretty tremendous force, striking at least 8 targets inside Syria, 8 targets, Iranian targets and Syrian regime targets. Remember, the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria has rolled out the welcome mat for the Iranian regime. And in Iran's mind, they're not going anywhere. So Israel, rightly so, holds not only Iran responsible for these attempted attacks out of Syrian territory, but it holds the Assad regime accountable, just as Israel says, look, if Hezbollah carries out, God forbid, some sort of attack out of southern Lebanon, Israel says, hey, we will hold the Lebanese government accountable, because at the end of the day, the Lebanese government with Hezbollah, the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad with the Iranian regime, they are permitting these terrorist entities safe harbor on their soil. Assad knows what Iran is up to. Again, he has welcomed them in to his country with open arms. He is essentially an Iranian proxy now. He pretty much owes Iran and Russia his hide. They bailed him out. He was on the ropes in that Syrian civil war. Iran and Russia came in, and Hezbollah as well, Iran's most lethal proxy, came in and bailed Assad out because Iran is hell-bent on establishing a permanent base, a permanent foothold in Syria, clearly from which it can attack Israel. We've seen it time and time again. Israel has struck Iranian targets hundreds of times over the past several years inside Syria. What is Iran doing in Syria? Why isn't the international community, the UN, saying more about this? Very interesting. But here's some of the targets that Israeli jets struck overnight. This was overnight, Wednesday, November 18th. According to the Times of Israel, the targets included this is inside Syria. Israel struck a military base used by Iran to direct its forces in Syria. Now, this military base was located right near Syria's Damascus International Airport. Not only that, Israel struck a secret barracks used by top Iranian commanders in Syria, which they also used to host visiting delegations from Tehran. And also, this was also near Damascus. And then Israel struck a base of the Syrian military's 7th Division, which cooperates widely with Iran. And also they struck mobile Syrian surface-to-air missile batteries and some Syrian arms depots. These were just some of the 8 targets, at least 8 targets that the Israeli Air Force struck just last night. Overnight, we woke up and we heard this news right on Wednesday, November 18th. So the big question now is, okay, will the Iranian regime retaliate? Again, Israel has struck Iran repeatedly over the past several years, Iran and Hezbollah inside Syria. Does the Iranian regime try to respond? We've said it many times here, folks. Iran does not seem to be getting the memo. Again and again, when Iran has attempted to, say, fly attack drones into Israel, plant bombs on Israeli soil, send fighters to open fire on Israeli troops across the Lebanon borders or the Syria borders into northern Israel, time and time again, these attempts have been foiled by the Israel Defense Forces. And not only that, Israel responds with overwhelming force and knocks Iran's assets back in Syria and does serious damage to what Iran is trying to accomplish, in particular, the military presence that Iran is hell-bent on establishing in Syria. And Israeli officials, one Israeli official said this morning, this was a message to the Iranian regime. These strikes that Israel carried out last night, in response, by the way, to an act of war. When an enemy nation, whether it's Syria or the Iranian regime, is planting bombs with the intent to kill Israeli soldiers, hey, that's an act of war. But an Israeli defense official said, hey, these strikes last night were meant not only to send Iran a message to back up from the Israel-Syria border, but to get out of Syria entirely. Folks, that is the key point. Israel's not just saying, hey, we want you away from that Israel-Syria border. Israeli officials are saying from the top down, we want you out of Syria, Iran. You have no place in Syria, and we will not allow a nation that is devoted to our destruction to establish a permanent military beachhead at our northeastern border. It's a non-starter. Unfortunately, we already have that situation in southern Lebanon, obviously, where Hezbollah has this massive base on Israel's doorstep. Israel says to Iran, we will not allow you to duplicate the Hezbollah scenario in Syria. So what we have here, folks, is a collision course. The Iranian regime says, hey, we are in Syria to stay. This is crucial to our strategy to wipe Israel off the map and our complete regional outlook. And Israel says, no way. Existential threat, we will not allow you to stay. So collision course between Iran and Israel over Syria. We've talked many times here on the newscast about the looming Great Northern War. It is at the doorstep, folks. Israel eventually will, it's not a question of if, but when, will face off in a major conflict against the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, those radical Shia militias spread across Syria and southern Lebanon. It is coming. By the way, this is just another punch in the nose and another embarrassment for the Iranian regime. Just yesterday here on the Watchman Newscast, we talked about how Israel reportedly took out Al-Qaeda's #2 leader on Iranian soil. And this followed, obviously, an entire summer of sabotage and targeting and explosions at Iran's military and sensitive ballistic missile sites on Iranian soil, which many believe Israeli agents carried out. So, hey, another black eye for the Iranian regime. We will see if they retaliate. If they do, we will bring you all the breaking updates right here on the Watchman Newscast. Hey, be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell so you get alerts every time a new video is posted. These attacks, or these strikes yesterday, not only the bombs, which obviously provoked the Israeli strikes, but the strikes themselves. Look, Israel striking Iranian targets, a major story, right? It's gotten scant coverage so far in the mainstream media. We want to be your home for breaking news out of the Middle East, because what happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. Israel is the apple of God's eye, and we want to bring you all of the latest information coming from God's land and from the most strategic, pivotal region in the world, the Middle East. So, hey, be sure to subscribe. Again, check out yesterday's newscast in our archives right here on YouTube about the death of Al-Qaeda's second in command, Mohammed al-Masri, apparently at the hands of Israel on Iranian soil. It's a fascinating story. And tomorrow on the newscast, check right back here on YouTube on our channel, we will have much more on Iran's illicit nuclear weapons program and some very interesting reports that President Trump recently had been discussing possible strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. You won't want to miss it right here on the Watchman Newscast tomorrow. We will be back in our studio as usual tomorrow, but today, breaking news had to come to you down and dirty just from my phone in my living room because the content is key and this is information you need to know. Until tomorrow from the Watchman Newscast, God bless you, and remember, never hold your peace.